Amen. I appreciate Johnny leading those songs that go so well with what we're talking about this morning. We have once each month this year, in spite of it all, we have looked at a trait or an attribute of the God of heaven. Learning more about God, and we've sort of titled the series, O Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you. As we think about God's attributes or characteristics that make him God, I was trying to remember all that we have covered thus far, and I'm going to attempt it, as there have been 6 before, and I've slept since the last one. Sometimes I have a preacher friend that we send each other, we use the little Marco Polo app, we'll send each other a Marco Polo video each Sunday evening or Monday. We call it the Sunday debrief. And sometimes I'll send him the Marco Polo Sunday evening, or it might even be Monday morning, and I'll say, well, yesterday I preached. Let me think about that. So sometimes even just one day later. But we have talked about God he's all powerful, he's all present, he's all knowing, all loving. God is immutable or unchanging, and God is just. Hey, there we go. I got him. I can't believe it. But we've talked about those 6 leading up to this point, and I want to say, as we talk about this particular attribute of God, we've noticed several already, and we have a few more to go, obviously. But I think about this. Some people would have us to believe that all life has evolved. Literally from nothing. Somewhere along the way, something came from nothing. Never happened before, never happened since, but that's what we're told. And humans, the idea is, just so happen to be at the top of the food chain. We just so happen to be the most highly evolved of all life, particularly the animal kingdom. But what we're talking about this morning, this often overlooked attribute of God, creativity, it argues strongly against evolution. It's interesting because what we're going to talk about is God's creativity. It's not so much God being creator, he is, and that is inherent within this. But I saw this some time ago. I think it might have been a sermon outline or something, and it gave me, I saw it as I was already kind of thinking about this series, and it gave me an additional lesson that I thought, I want to put that together. I want to explore that a little further, because I'd never really thought about an attribute of God being his creativity. But God's creativity, the variety, the design, the creativity that we see in life and all of creation, it results from God's creativity. Not coincidence, not chance, but God's creativity. That's what we're talking about this morning. That we're going to look at just 2 areas, but boy, they really resonate as far as God's creativity. 2 areas that we want to notice. If you have your handout, you see that we're looking at this in terms of creation, looking at just creation in general, and then we'll look more specifically at God's creativity as seen in humanity. But think about this with me for just a few moments. Look at God's creativity as it is seen in creation. Think about the creation process. We're going to go to Genesis 1 here, so go ahead and turn in your Bibles there. God's creativity when it comes to creation. Really, the whole chapter pretty much of Genesis describes the creation process. He spoke the universe into existence at least 8 times in this passage. You have the phrase, God said, as he speaks creation into existence. Now, it's used more often than that, but I'm talking in terms of him speaking something into existence. 8 times in this passage. You see it over and over, and I won't read all these verses, but In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And by the way, you think about God's creativity and this attribute of God, it's hard to talk about it without talking about God being the God of order. And I realized that I couldn't make that happen. So I think we're probably going to have at least in my sermon files, this is part 7 of the series. Of course, this being the 7th month, but I already had it set up for 12 lessons. So there's probably going to be a 7D next week, and we'll talk about order, because it's just hard to separate these two and not talk about it. But we're going to focus on creativity this morning. But the earth is without form, and darkness is upon the face of the deep. Spirit of God moved upon, I think the ASV has brooded over the face of the waters. God said, let there be light. Verse 3, there was light. He divides the light from the darkness. God said, verse 6, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Then the evening and the morning were the second day, verse 8. Verse 9, God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place. Let the dry land appear. And it was so. Then you drop down to verse 13. The evening and the morning were the third day. God said, verse 14, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide day from night, or the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And he, of course, goes on and makes two lights, made the stars. Evening and the morning were the fourth day, verse 19 tells us. Then you have it again, verse 20. God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and the fowl that may fly above the earth, and the open firmament of heaven. Evening and the morning were the fifth day. And then verse 24, God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth after his kind, and it was so. And then, of course, verse 26, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. God spoke this universe into existence. Not only that, he named what he made. And you see this, God has, I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit, but you probably can guess where we're going with some of this. Being made in the image of God, at least part of that is we have creativity, right? And so you're going to see this right there in the creation. God's going to bring the animals before Adam, and he's going to do what? He's going to name them. You see that image of God, at least in that aspect. But in verse 5, he calls the light day, he calls the darkness night. You drop down to verse 8, he calls the firmament heaven. You look at verse 10, God called the dry land earth. The gathering together of the waters called he seas. So he speaks everything into existence. He names what he's made. And, God's creation, it just displays his creativity. And that's a lot of what, there's a lot wrapped up in Psalm 19, verse 1, but that certainly is a big aspect of it. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth, displays his handiwork, literally the work of his hands. Now, God's a spirit being. He doesn't have literal hands, but what is it saying? The firmament shows his creativity. Boy, don't you see it. Sometimes I can be going through Facebook and maybe somebody posts a picture of a sunset or a great scenery or something like that, and sometimes even Christians will post something like that with some kind of a caption that says something to the effect of God showing off his handiwork, or isn't God the best artist, or something like that. That's all God's creativity on display through creation. But we see it in the creation process. What about, I'm about to forget part of my slide here. This also means God's creation on display in God's creativity on display in creation. It also means we can see God in nature. I don't want to move on past this without mentioning Romans 1:20, because that's what Paul is talking about by inspiration when he says, look, there's no excuse. He says the invisible things of him, of God, in other words, from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. There's no excuse for a complete lack of belief in God. And I'm not saying that in an ugly, mean way. I'm just saying there's no logical explanation. And when we see the creativity in nature, we see God. I don't mean that in a mysterious way. I'm seeing God with my eyes. It's through the eyes of his creativity on display in creation. And it's amazing. And he says, there's no excuse not to know God is when you look at creation and you see the creativity. Now, let's talk about the design in creation. You see, creativity goes hand in hand with design. And some of this falls under order, and again, we'll touch on more of this in the follow-up. But God designed everything with a purpose. There's so many verses we could look at and talk about this, but one that came to mind was Isaiah 45:18. Thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not in vain, for he formed it to be inhabited. He formed it with a purpose. What other planet in our universe, and what other planet out there, period, what other celestial body has life, has humanity, or anything similar? God made this earth for life. It's not coincidence. It's not chance. That's how he made it. That's his creativity. That's his design in creation. He finishes that verse, God speaking through Isaiah, and he says, I am the Lord, and there is none else. I also wanted to mention that verse because there's a Hebrew word in there, and I'm no expert in Hebrew. I've told you this before. I don't claim to be, but there are others who are, and I can read after them. They say this word is pronounced yatsar or something similar to that, but it's translated often formed. Not every time, but it's often, probably most often, translated as formed, F-O-R-M-E-D. You see that in Isaiah 45:18, God himself that formed the earth and made it. This is an interesting word because when you look it up, I just use Strong's. There are other Hebrew dictionaries, lexicons, but Strong's defines this word as meaning to mold into a form, especially as a potter. In fact, there are times in the Old Testament where the word is actually translated potter. The word is often associated with design and creativity. In fact, when you see someone, if you've ever watched anybody make pottery, I've not had a whole lot of opportunity to see that, but I've seen it once or twice. Pretty simple stuff, nothing real super fancy, but even the simple stuff I saw, I was just amazed, just mesmerized watching them work with that and the creativity that was on display. Reagan and I, on our 10th anniversary, we went up to the Biltmore Mansion, took a trip up there and spent a few days, and we stopped in a little town called Bremen that Sunday on our way up, and I tried out to become their preacher. I won't spoil it and tell you how that turned out, but we went up there, and part of our time there, they had a blacksmith. And you could go and watch him, and he would just form, and he made this keychain. I'm talking literally, he took a chunk of metal. I don't remember what kind of metal it was, but it had no form, no nothing. It was just a chunk. And he began to work with it, and he would put it in the fire, and he would get it hot, and he would bring it out, and it'd be just glowing, and he'd start to hammer, and then it was just, I was dumbstruck, probably because I'm so lacking in creativity, quite honestly. So I was just blown away by this guy, what he could do. And he took that same piece of metal, and he actually did the little ring where you made the ring where you can slide your keys on there and stuff. It was just unreal, the creativity that fella had. And he made this keychain. I think he made it into a leaf shape. And he only had one. There were several of us standing around watching it. And There was a young child there that wanted it. He thought it was as cool as any of us, and he wanted it. And so I started to take it from him, but I decided not to, and I let him have that. But I wanted that thing. I wanted to bring it home, and because I was just so amazed. But you see that in this Hebrew word, it's often translated formed, and it's the idea of a potter, someone fashioning something. It's often used of what God has formed. It's also, by the way, used many times to talk about in the Old Testament and how people would sometimes fashion an idol. God would talk about you worshiping the works of your own hands. Creativity, design in creation. I don't have time to give you just too many of these, but I did want to give you a few. Some of these, there's a book called Christianity Stands True by Lynn Gardner. Some of these are from that, some are from other sources, but just a couple of examples. As we talk about design and creation, it's hard not to talk about some of this and just to appreciate God's creativity on display in creation. We're going to talk about humanity kind of in general, but I want to mention here in this section the eye, the retina. It's about 1 square inch of tissue inside the eye. Has over 100 million light receptor cells. You probably have studied this in school, cones and rods. They convert light into electrochemical energy, enabling you to see. The eye is a very delicate camera. It takes about 196 color photos per second. Has its own light meter, protection, cleaning equipment, and self-repairing abilities. I don't know what your most expensive camera is or who has the most expensive camera in here. They can't do that. Guarantee you. It sure can't repair itself, can it? If you've ever owned an expensive camera that got broken, you know the heartache that goes with that, and you realize, uh-oh, I'm going to take this thing to get repaired if it can be repaired. We understand the human eye can be damaged beyond that point, but there's not a camera out there that can self-repair like the human eye. The ear. The ear didn't happen by accident, of course. The outer ear collects sound waves from the air. I mean, this is going on right now, if you're listening, and funnels them to the eardrum. The waves cause the eardrum to vibrate. Eardrums can sense frequencies that move the eardrum only 1/billionth of a centimeter. Vibrations are mechanically transmitted and amplified through the 3 connecting bones in the inner ear. These mechanical vibrations enter a fluid in the inner ear. Waves are converted into nerve impulses by the 24,000 auditory receptor cells in each ear. The auditory nerve transmits these to the brain, enabling a person to hear. And oh, by the way, it all happens just like that. It also gives you balance. If you ever have inner ear problems, you know sometimes you can't even stand up. You think that just evolved by chance? The heart beats about 100,000 times per day, pumping 5.8 tons of blood per day, enough to fill a 4,000-gallon tank car. The entire circulatory system includes passageways totaling about 60,000 miles. The heart is self-lubricating, high capacity, and self-regulating. Our skeleton makes up about 1/5 of our body weight, yet because of its design, it's more flexible and stronger for its size than if it were made of steel or even wood. A man's thigh bone is strong enough to support the weight of a small car. The brain, the skeletal structure, the eye, the ear, all of creation shows design. I've said it before, I will say it again. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I can look around me and I can see evidence, and it screams design, creativity, not blind chance. With all due respect, give me a break. That is not chance or coincidence. You see God's creativity in the creation process. You see it in creation. You see the variety that is in creation. You know, what if every single human being looked alike, or every animal looked the same? How boring would that world be? But God designs variety within creation, within humans, within animals, within landscapes. I mean, what if every place on earth looked the same? You know, sometimes we say, well, I'm going to, I often go to Costa Rica. And people say, oh, it's so beautiful down there. I visited there before, or maybe I've gone on a mission trip there before. It's so beautiful. And sometimes we can go maybe see a volcano. Sometimes we can go somewhere within the jungles. Somebody else may say, I'm going to Hawaii. Oh, man, it's so beautiful there. And going to see the Grand Canyon. I got to go out there once when I was in college and visit that for a little bit. All these different places on earth are just magnificent. Always just, billions of years of erosion, right? Carved this mile deep, sometimes a mile across canyon out in the desert. No, there's creativity of God there, particularly as the flood and some of the effects from the flood. But what if every place on earth looked the same? There was nowhere to go and say, well, I like right here where I am, and boy, it's beautiful, but I sure want to go and see the mountains, or I want to go to the beach and see that. All these different places, the creativity that you see in trees, plants, food, animals, landscapes, it's just amazing. And the variety in creation shows God's creativity. He could have made everything the same, right? But he didn't, because he's creative. And you can't win with some people, because if God makes everything the same, they say, well, if there really was a God, he wouldn't just make everything all the same. So boring. But sometimes God did use, you'll see sometimes people will talk about, well, it's evidence for evolution, common ancestry, because there's some similarity between this creature and that creature. They don't talk about all the massive differences, but there's a little bit of similarity here. And well, what if God, kind of like we do sometimes? I don't know a whole lot about computer programming. I used to be able to work on computers just a little bit as far as troubleshooting, but programming was always like way out of my range. But I did learn a little bit. I had to take one class, and I struggled through it. But one of the things that I learned is that programmers, quite often, they write sometimes chunks of code or bits of code, and you may have a project over here, and this is one of the things that frustrated me in my class because we weren't allowed to do that. But you may have a project over here, and you got to write this big, unique code. But as a part of that, you may take a code over here that somebody has just put out on the internet or said, here, I'm offering this for somebody who wants to use it. No need to reinvent the wheel, as we say, right? And so you grab that and you use it. That happens all the time in programming. Well, what if God did that in creation? Certainly he did. That's why you see some similarity sometimes, even across kinds. It doesn't mean there's common ancestry, but such variety in creation. Again, there's understanding that we could get carried away with this, but I want to give you two examples that I ran across. Again, same book there. The Venus flytrap. You probably have heard of this before, but it's an amazing thing. It's a plant, but it's a plant that is carnivorous. It eats flies, as you might guess from the name. But you see creativity in this. Man, do you see creativity in it. It's a plant. It's an intricate trap with long bristles around the edges. It gives off a sweet smell that entices its prey. When an insect is tempted into the center of the plant and touches these trigger hairs, the trap snaps shut within a half second, capturing the insect. I sometimes can't catch them with a fly swat, but this thing does. The trigger hairs are so sophisticated that they can actually distinguish false stimuli. A drop of rain hits it, it doesn't snap shut. But let a fly get on there, now you watch it. In fact, I actually found a little time-lapse video. Might have been on Wikipedia that I found it if you want to check it out, where you can watch this thing, 3 different plants sitting in I guess, a greenhouse or something, and all 3 of them, before that time lapse is over, have caught flies. It's amazing. That's one example. The archer fish is another interesting creature. Has complex eyes. They bulge out farther than those of normal fish, so it can focus both eyes on a single object. Pushes its bony tongue against the groove in the top of its mouth. Water is brought in through a quick snap of the gills, and he fires water through this barrel. and he spits it at insects that are above the water. Allowing for, this is what he does. When he does that, he makes allowances for water refraction, light refraction, wind velocity. And this archerfish, a grown archerfish, can hit a target, an insect, up to 10 feet above the water with just stunning accuracy. Are there critters in the water they could eat? Yeah. Why is he spitting at stuff above the water, outside the water? You want to know why? An evolutionist can't answer it. In fact, they'll say it's perplexing. We can't understand this. He has a food supply in the water, but he wants things out of the water. That's strange. He didn't need this to survive. It ain't strange. It's God's creativity. The ability to spout was not necessary to survival, an evolutionist said, because so it's difficult to account for its development by natural selection. It's because it didn't happen by natural selection. It happened by God's creativity. Study the bombardier beetle sometime. I remember that. I just first learned about that when I was I'm still a big kid, but a younger kid than I am now, maybe college age, and I ran across this critter, and that is something else. Two different chemicals, together they form an explosion, separate, they're benign. But he can mix them together. He has a chamber, he can mix them together. It doesn't blow him up. And he can fire it with amazing accuracy. How does that evolve? I mean, how many bombardier beetles die before you evolve that ability? Well, they all do. You're extinct before you evolve that ability. But God's creativity designed it that way. God's creativity over and over seen in creation. And in God's creativity is seen in humanity. Mankind, as we just read in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, is made in the image of God. God could have made us in any image he wanted. Could have made us in the image of lions or tigers or bears or whatever it might be. But he chose to make us in his image. Could have made us in any image he wanted, and he did, in his image. This doesn't mean you look like God physically. When we use that expression, sometimes we'll say, you're a spitting image of your daddy. We mean physical appearance. This doesn't mean physical appearance. What being made in the image of God means is several things, and we could talk about more even, I suppose, but just for our purposes here this morning, it means we're spirit beings, but we're housed in a temporary body. You don't have a soul or a spirit. You are a soul. You are a spirit. You have a body. And it would do us all well to think about that from time to time, because this body is going to die and be gone. It's going to decay. But that spirit lives on. I don't have a soul. I am a soul. And I need to think about that every day. It's housed in a temporary body, but it's going to live on. Being made in the image of God means, number two, we're intellectual beings. No animal even comes close. Oh, just the top of the evolutionary food chain, huh? Give me a break. There's not an animal that comes close. There's not an animal out there that says, wouldn't it be awesome if we went on the side, you don't go on the Serengeti and see where lions have gotten together and say, wouldn't it be great if we look at that rock face, how it's very sheer. What if we painted a mural on that? Wouldn't that be beautiful? The monkeys don't get together and do that. They don't get together and form a symphony. They don't get groups together and say we're going to read books and talk about it or have a think tank and maybe we can solve a problem among the animal kingdom. Come on. Just the highest evolved animal. There's not an animal that comes anywhere within range of even being close. We are intellectual beings made in the image of God. We're free will beings. We're capable of choosing. It's kind of a joke. What is that, Finding Nemo? The sharks, bless their hearts, are trying so hard to stop eating the fish. Well, that's a cartoon, and we can laugh at it, but it ain't real life. You'll never run across a shark. You're bleeding in the ocean. He comes up and he says, "Ooh, that's so tempting." But I said I was going to stop eating meat. I'm a vegetarian shark, so it's your lucky day. If you're in that situation, you're in trouble. You know, a lion, predators, carnivores, they never stop and go, I feel so bad for that. I shouldn't have done that. I feel so guilty, and I need to talk to somebody about this and get this off my chest. There's no remorse. That's what they were made for. We're free will beings. Humans are. But you know, we're also creative beings. We have the ability, the capability to appreciate art, music, literature. And part of the creativity in humanity is that not everybody's the same. Your creativity may be in art. There are people that can draw stuff just freehand that just blows my mind. I couldn't do it. I can barely draw a stick man. Somebody else's creativity may be with music. I mean, you know, we see this sometimes, right? You're just mesmerized by how somebody can play an instrument. Somebody's creativity may be in a sport. Somebody's, you know, all these different areas that people have their own individual creativity. Not by chance, not by coincidence. It's how God made us. There's a lot that goes into that, but it's not just a product of evolution. We see God's creativity and his dealings with mankind. We're made in the image of God, and that means a lot of things, a few of which we talked about, but also his dealings with mankind, his speaking to man. You know, in 1 Samuel 3, he speaks to Samuel, this voice in the night. Samuel, not Samuel. Yes, it is Samuel. He says, Samuel, and he runs to Eli. And he says, here I am. And Eli says, I didn't call you. Happens 3 times, and Eli finally says, next time it happens, you say, speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. It was God speaking to him. God spoke to people that way. In 1 Kings 19, he speaks to Elijah, still small voice. But you know, Hebrews 1 and 2 tells us very clearly, God hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. Could God have spoken the same all through time? Always in the exact same way? Well, sure. You see some creativity in that. Why did he choose to do it that way? I don't know. It's just his creativity. Why does somebody choose to paint this instead of painting that? Why does somebody choose to draw this instead of drawing that? There's just unique individual creativity. But you also see this in God's salvation of mankind. This is not how most people would envision it, right? Salvation, I mean, Jesus has a humble birth. She brought forth her firstborn, placed him in a manger, Luke 1:7, because there was no room for them in the inn or in the guest house. Jesus comes into this world a very humble birth, not how we might have expected a king to be born, right? Not how we might have expected God in the flesh to have been born. Humble life. Matthew 8:20, he says, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. He's homeless. There were people that helped him and looked after him and helped in various ways, but he says, I don't really have a permanent residence. Humble life, humble demeanor. Matthew 11:28-30, you know the verses where he says, take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest to your souls. And you know he gives a very simple plan. Again, not what many people, obviously not what many people expect, because so many people stumble at the plain, clear teaching of Scripture when he says, whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life, John 3:16. God commands all men everywhere to repent, Acts 17:30. And he tells us, with the mouth confession is made unto salvation, Romans 10:10. And of course, Peter's instruction on the day of Pentecost to repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins. And the Lord adds the saved to his church, his body, Acts 2:47, Ephesians 1:22 and 23. God's creative in his dealings with mankind. I want you to stop and think about it. Maybe you've not ever given it a whole lot of thought. I honestly, as I said, I saw this some time ago, and I don't know that I had given it a whole lot of thought before then. The creativity of God. Think about it. His creativity on display, and how glad we ought to be that we see so much creativity, because it helps add variety to our lives. We get our creativity from God, and you think about every advance that has ever been made by humanity is because they used the creativity given to them by God. Some people use their creativity to do bad things, but when people choose to put it to good use, think about all the advances we have seen in this old world because somebody used their creativity. Maybe you never gave it much thought. Pause from time to time and consider the creativity of God. In it, I hope you will see how interested He is in you. He gave you your creativity. In His creativity, He shows His love for you, His interest in you, that He wants you to be saved. If you're a child of God, think about the creativity of God and think about the creativity that He's given you and find ways to put that to use in service to the Lord and His kingdom. Creativity is on display in creation, it's on display in us, and it's all from our creative God. Think about it. He's interested in you. He loves you. If we can help you in any way in getting your life right with Him, keeping your life right with Him, that's why we extend heaven's invitation. Won't you come as we stand and sing?